Welcome to our podcast, doing Black History during lockdown, lessons from the Birmingham Industrial Heritage Project at Aston University. I'm Brian Tudlow, and I'm a lecturer on the history programmes at Aston University. Now in late 2021, we're still living through the turbulence caused by the coronavirus pandemic. It doesn't seem that long ago, really, since we were in full lockdown in the first half of 2021, and then for the first time back in spring 2020. These were very odd times for students and for teachers, for lecturers alike. And the challenges of keeping on were never harder than those months when we could hardly go out except for essential work or urgent chores. And I think one of the many things that amazed me during this time was our students' readiness to carry on in the teeth of adversity, working away at their studies and their research. Now, here at Aston University, our programmes are about global history here in the heart of Birmingham. And in our teaching and in the students' research, we try to find that convergence point between the great global stories and the local stories. And one of the areas in which we do this specifically is in our work on Black history. And last year and carrying on this year, some of our students have been involved in a project which we've called Birmingham Industrial Heritage, looking at the past, Birmingham's past, and the way in which one of the great glories of Birmingham, industrial progress, the Industrial Revolution, overlapped as well with the great global history of the slave trade. So with me are two of our students from our final year who were involved in this project. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, so my name is Hinna, and I'm a final year student, and I'm currently studying history and English literature here at Aston University.
Thank you. Hinna, welcome.
Hello, I'm Kaur, and I'm currently studying history and politics here at Aston University.
Thank you. Thank you. Hinna and Kiranpreet, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for joining me. Thanks for being willing to come and chat, both about your projects and also about history during lockdown. I think it might be helpful for those watching if we could say, first of all, something about why this is a difficult project to tackle, this Birmingham industrial heritage theme. Who'd like to start?
Yeah, I don't mind. So basically, it was quite difficult looking into Birmingham's own links with the slave trade, as there was quite little available online to look for information. However, the information that we did find was really relevant, and because there was a lot which confronted like London's links with Liverpool, the slave trade, and how they profited of it. However, there was little about Birmingham, and I think it's important to acknowledge. And I think with the resources that we had at the time, I think we kind of overcame this challenge.
Thanks, Hinna. And I wonder also if this project might be difficult because of what it says about Birmingham as well. Kiranpreet, what do you think?
I think the issue with this project is that we kind of view our industrial heritage here in Birmingham very proudly, and this kind of talks about the darker side of it. So it's difficult to talk about because we're not proud of it, and there isn't any pride to be given in such a horrible part of history.
But it's still a part of history that has to be understood, isn't it? And I guess that's the key thing. We can't just look at history for the nice stories, for the happy stories. We've also got to look at the more difficult stories too, haven't we? So maybe we should start with the end point, if you like, which is about the outputs. What you actually produced at the end of your project. Who'd like to start?
Yeah, I don't mind. So throughout our project, we were all tasked with different kind of topics to look at, and how we were going to deliver this kind of information that we found. We chose different types of medias. So for my type of media, I chose to make an Instagram page. So we were all tasked with doing different topics, different kind of outlets, how we were going to show this our project. So for me, I thought it was best to kind of so all the information that I'd found, because there was quite a lot, despite the limitations that we did have, I managed to. I wanted to condense and consolidate all the notes that I had made into these small posts. And I think it was just really useful to it also like targeting a younger audience. And also it was quite manageable to write the notes we had in small posts and post it, instead of posting like all the information that we had, obviously, because it would have been really long and it would have been like more harder to follow. So I think the Instagram page, that was my thought behind creating the Instagram page. And I think the main aim was just to have short, quick notes on how these people influenced how the links were to the slave trade in Birmingham. And I think that as we went along, the more research that came around, that it was just really helpful to have this Instagram page, because we could just add things, and we had different like modes. We could post stories, we could also post Instagram videos, also like different story pictures that we could put as well. So it was really just like a really easy way, and also a really accessible way as well to post this information.
And what were the themes that the images cover?
So the images cover mainly the different buildings, the different individual statues, museums. So like a really broad kind of range of things to kind of show the links between Birmingham and the slave trade. Because I didn't want to just look down one single avenue. I wanted to like broaden the search, and this really gave me that opportunity to showcase the different stuff. And I also focused on different abolitionists as we went along, just to kind of show that it wasn't all. There was positives as well. There was people who tried to abolish this trade. So I think it was important to include that as well.
Sure. And I mean, if people in Birmingham are wandering around, wondering which kind of buildings you're talking about, which buildings are they?
So there's different kind of buildings. If you scroll here to the bottom, there's the gun proof house in Birmingham. There's also Soho Museum, which is, well, it's now a museum under the Birmingham's National Trust. And also there's different statues. There's even the clock tower. There's so many different kind of things that have links to Birmingham. And I think it was just really interesting to kind of see this. And also in the museums as well, there's different exhibitions, things like that kind of showcase this slave trade as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And was there not also a blog that you produced? You gathered some of your findings on a blog, didn't you?
That was my output. I decided to do the blog because with the Instagram page you are quite limited to only a few sentences, whereas with the blog post you can discuss a story or a piece of history at length, and with the blog it's more easily accessible, and it kind of reduces the jargon that we kind of associate with history, especially academic history. As well as that, it's all about kind of providing accessibility to the younger generation who oftentimes aren't taught about Birmingham's links to the slave trade or even the slave trade in general. And my blog post kind of mainly focused upon the lesser known connections with the slave trade. The first one was to do with the canals, and whenever we think of the canals, we don't really automatically provide a connection with the slave trade, in spite of the fact that the slave trade funded the canals, and then the canals also funded the slave trade. It was very much a synchronous relationship between the two. As well as that, I also looked at legacy and how the legacy of Birmingham is connected to the industrial heritage and the slave trade through the flag of the Black country.
Mm. We'll come back to the flag later on, because I think it's a very important story about what's happened to the legacy of the slave trade in more recent times. Well, I think those watching might want to hear about some of the people who you were looking at in your projects, and Hinna, I think back to you at the moment, because I believe you looked very closely at Samuel Galton.
Yeah, so Samuel Galton was a member of the Birmingham Quaker dynasty, and they were like this group of gun makers, merchants, and he was also a member of the Lunar Society. And I think there was many of them included in individuals such as Joseph Priestley, Josiah Wedgwood, James Watt included as well. And part of his business involved the manufacture of different guns and different kind of resources that were exchanged for slaves on the west coast of Africa. So a bit about Samuel Galton. He worked closely with Matthew Bolton and James Watt, who I'll come on to in a moment. And he was one of the most successful businessmen in the group, resulting from his different involvement in a variety of ventures, and this included like the canal development. So like today, there's a bridge in Smethwick named Smethwick Galton Bridge. So I think his legacy is still here today. And despite he was part of the Quaker Society, which had a very they didn't really approve of the use of guns or the manufacture of guns, so they had begun to question this, and he started to face really intense disapproval from the society, and he was criticized for his involvement within the slave trade, and I think that was just how he wasn't really fazed by this kind of stuff, and he took over his father's business, and I think he just wanted to kind of create a legacy, and he was commemorated for it, and he still is commemorated for it. So I think that's really important to know as well. And it kind of leads on to James Watt as well, who basically worked closely with Matthew Bolton. There's a statue in Birmingham. It's not there at the moment because the area is under renovation. But there's a statue named the Golden Boys, and it's usually placed in Birmingham. And they were also some of the most famous industrialists of his age, and they worked in one of the largest factories in the world at the time, and they manufactured steam engines, and they created an enormous amount of wealth. And they were both one of the pioneering individuals of the engineering industry at the time. And I think during the time as well, they both profited quite a lot of these steam engines, and also because of these were also used during the slave trade. They both had like links to the slave trade, as they accumulated quite a lot of profit of it, which funded their own ventures in the steam engines, things like that. So I think their link to the slave trade is quite important as well to acknowledge, because it wasn't just because nobody really questions how they got their funding from, because they're just known today as the individuals who were like key in the Industrial Revolution. But I think it's important to note that they were quite also heavily involved with the slave trade, which is what not many people know about. We just see them, the statues, we celebrate it kind of, and see their legacy as that, but we don't really see the dark side of what they did as well.
So it seems like one of the key resources, but one of the hidden resources of this great industrial revolution is, in fact, the labour that was helping to create the capital that underpinned the kind of progress which Birmingham is rightly proud of in many ways. But I suppose what you're saying here is that there's a hidden story to some extent that we don't like to remember as much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think there's really with a lot of the people that we found, there's a very hidden kind of stories behind them. So with many of the statues we just walk past in Birmingham, we just see those, but we don't really understand or we don't acknowledge the history behind it, and how these actually had, not all, but many of them had links to the slave trade, and how it was done in secret. And a lot of Birmingham's history like this has been kind of brushed under the carpet. It's been kind of hidden until we've kind of came along and tried to make sense of it and make it more out there and acknowledge it more and make it just known.
Okay, thank you. And Kiranpreet, you also were working on a very significant industrialist. Do you want to tell us about him?
I looked into Benjamin Molyneux and the Molyneux family. We kind of know Molyneux as the namesake of the Molyneux Stadium of the Wolverhampton Wanderers. But what I found out through my research, actually through my reading of Black and British, A Forgotten History by David Olusoga, is that within the book, it is a brief footnote, but within that I found out that he actually owned a slave called George Africanus. And I found that quite interesting because with the Molyneux family and Benjamin Molyneux himself, we only ever think of him as an ironmonger and a banker, and in turn this great Molyneux family heritage, which is shown through the Molyneux Hotel, known as the Wolverhampton Archives, and obviously the stadium. What I found rather interesting about Molyneux is that he actually owned a slave, and the slave was actually in Wolverhampton at the time. Because when I started out doing the research for this, a lot of the connections with slavery were quite slim because they didn't actually see the slaves. We have a deep connection to slavery, but it's always through the funding of slavery and through the funding of the guns, but never an actual slave. And I found that rather interesting purely because it's quite uncommon for Birmingham at the time. And another connection I found out about George Africanus is that he ended up becoming free actually near the end of his life, which also connects Birmingham and the surrounding area to kind of, because yes, we have a darker history of slave trade and slavery, but we also have almost a positive side to a horrible situation, which is that we also talk about freedom, and we have a great pride in freedom, but yet we never talk about the kind of freedom that Birmingham has a connection to.
And I suppose that brings us then very much up to the present day story of Birmingham as a destination point for migrants from all around the world, but especially since the 1950s, migrants from the Caribbean, and also from West and East Africa as well. But before we get to that story, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about those people who were in Birmingham in the 19th century, but who were looking forward to that point at which the slaves would be free.
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge the people who helped abolish the slave trade. So there's an individual called Joseph Sturge, who was an English Quaker abolitionist and activist, and he founded the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, and worked a lot to support the emancipation of slaves, not just in England and Birmingham, but more on like national scale, more like out of the country. So he did a lot of work to kind of abolish slavery in England, especially, and also there was an anti-slavery society in Birmingham, who also, obviously, their aim was to have the immediate abolishment of slavery. And also there was the Female Society for Birmingham, which was founded in 1825 by individuals named Sue Townsend and Lucy Thompson. And these campaigns were, I think they were quite essential in abolishing slavery. And there was really a lot of individuals who came from America to kind of support these societies. So, for example, Frederick Douglass, Equiano, there was a lot of kind of individuals who came to support these societies and kind of abolish slavery. And I think it's important to acknowledge that while there were people who did fund the slave trade, there was people as well who were working just as hard to abolish it as well.
Great, thank you very much indeed. So let's come forward to the present day, because it seems in some ways that this story about helping to abolish slavery and ensure that every individual is free continues even today. We talk about the phenomenon of modern slavery, and as in the past, of course, it is a hidden thing as well. Although now it's illegal, whereas once upon a time it wasn't illegal. But there's also a tendency to forget, isn't there, about the legacy of the slave trade, or at least to forget about what it might mean to the people who are alive today. And I think you found an interesting story about that topic in the Black Country flag.
Yes, I did. One thing I've always found quite interesting about the Black Country flag is that it has a shackle on it, and how it kind of shows how proud we are of it, because we discuss slavery, but it's never mentioned in a British context. We talk about it from an American context, but there is a flag that was created in 2012 which proudly shows shackles, which their justification is that because of the iron industry in the Black Country area and the Birmingham area. But when I see the shackles, I immediately think of the slave trade, which Birmingham and the Black Country area had a deep connection to. And the shackles that they were creating were for the slave trade. And I find that really interesting, because we've kind of almost forgotten what slavery is, or the connection to slavery that we have here. And the Black Country flag is a great deal of pride for most people, but we also have to think about the horrible element of that flag, because instead of just talking about the pride of the industry, it came off the backs of Black people. It came off the backs of slaves who were tortured and maimed in the great idea of progress for Birmingham and the area. And I think the flag almost kind of talks about how we are blind to our heritage, fair enough, a horrible heritage, but we're blind to it because we don't want to talk about it, or because we haven't discussed it.
Yes, it seems like the presence of the shackles there suggests that this is a question that is now all resolved. That this is a story that's well behind us, and in fact, it's a safe part of our heritage, and we can talk easily about the mixture of industrial progress and hidden, exploited human labour without worrying too much about the implications. And yet the implications are still there, because the descendants of people from the Caribbean and from Africa, even though they're no longer even though they no longer have the status of slaves, of course, in this country they never did. There was a grand controversy actually about whether slaves were free when they arrived in the UK. It was eventually established in law that you couldn't remain a slave in the United Kingdom, but overseas they could be slaves. But to come back to the point. Clearly there is still prejudice. There are still certain disadvantages which have their historical roots in that status, in that slave status which existed. Before we bring everything to a conclusion, let me just bring you to this thorny issue of how we can make sense of on the one hand, the industrial heritage, and on the other hand, the slavery heritage. The city takes progress as one of its various mottos. The city very often references these heroes or grand figures of the Industrial Revolution, and yet the stories which you're helping uncover and which are there in the records show that this progress always came at a cost, and a cost that no one should have been made to pay. Is there any way do you think that we can make sense of that conundrum, or is it simply a paradox of history that we have to live with?
I think the best way to make sense of it is to talk about it and to actually educate the younger generation about it, because I remember when I was studying history during secondary school, we talk about the flag and we talk about Black country and Birmingham industry, but we never talk about slavery and the connection between the two. And I think the best way to kind of deal with the conundrum is just to start with education, and then from there kind of build upon it, but just to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Hinna, what would you say?
Yeah, I can only echo what Kiran says with how we need to educate and just make it like more apparent and make it more like so people are aware of the history behind certain things like statues, buildings, and I think the only way to do that is by educating people and having it more ingrained in the in like curriculums in schools, different things like that. And I think that way people can at least be aware of the history, and then they can take it how they want.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Hinna and Kiranpreet, for joining me for this discussion about Birmingham Industrial Heritage Project. And for anyone who's watching, if you want more information about Aston History's programs, you can go to our website. You can follow us on Twitter at Aston History, capital A, capital H. And we hope you'll tune in again soon to listen to further discussions and seminars that we're holding on the Aston Originals channel. Thank you very much again, Hinna and Kiranpreet, and we'll see